La Perfection, a Michelin-starred restaurant famed for its culinary artistry, was about to witness an extraordinary upheaval. When Grace, a serene 68-year-old black woman, took up a position as a lowly dishwasher, the volatile kitchen dynamics began to shift in unexpected ways. As Chef Daniel's reign of terror reached new heights, his verbal abuse and cruel treatment of staff became more extreme by the day. Amidst this chaos, Grace's quiet presence became a catalyst for change that no one saw coming. What hidden agenda lay behind Grace's humble facade, and what unexpected challenge awaits a chef who's never had his biases questioned? Before we dive into this tale of gastronomic intrigue that will simmer with tension and boil over with unexpected twists, share in the comments below where in the world you're watching or listening from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The Michelin-starred restaurant La Perfection stood tall and proud in the heart of the city, its gleaming facade a beacon for the rich and famous. Inside, the dining room buzzed with the quiet murmur of exclusive clientele, the clink of fine china, and the subtle pop of champagne corks. But behind the elegant veneer of the dining room lay a very different world, the kitchen. In this realm of stainless steel and searing heat, Chef Daniel reigned supreme. At 45, he was at the peak of his career, his name synonymous with culinary excellence. His salt and pepper hair and piercing blue eyes gave him an air of distinguished authority, while his nimble hands moved with the precision of a surgeon as he plated each dish. But beneath the surface of Daniel's culinary genius lurked a darker side. His temper was as hot as the flames that leaped from his professional-grade stoves, and his ego as inflated as a soufflé fresh from the oven. On this particular evening, the kitchen was in its usual state of controlled chaos. Line cooks moved with practiced efficiency, calling out orders and responding with sharp, "Yes, chef," at Daniel's every command. The air was thick with the aromas of sizzling meats, fragrant herbs, and the underlying tension that seemed to pulse through the kitchen like a living thing. Daniel stood at the pass, his eyes scanning each plate with laser focus. "This isn't good enough," he suddenly bellowed, causing the entire kitchen to freeze. He held up a plate of perfectly seared scallops, arranged in a delicate spiral. To the untrained eye, it looked flawless, but to Daniel, it was an abomination. "Look at this," he spat, thrusting the plate towards the young line cook who had prepared it. "The sear is uneven, the plating is sloppy. This is what you call Michelin star quality." Without warning, he tipped the plate, sending the delicate scallops tumbling to the floor. The line cook, a young man named Alex, stood frozen, his face a mask of shock and fear. I'm sorry, chef," he stammered. "I'll do it again right away." But Daniel wasn't finished. His face red with anger, he advanced on Alex, backing him into a corner. "Sorry? Sorry doesn't cut it in my kitchen. This is the third time this week you've messed up. Maybe you're not cut out for this. Maybe you should go flip burgers at McDonald's instead." The rest of the kitchen staff kept their heads down, pretending to be absorbed in their tasks. They'd seen this before, Daniel's rage, his cruel words, his ability to reduce even the most confident cook to a quivering mess. It was just another day in the pressure cooker that was La Perfection's kitchen. As Daniel continued his tirade, Sarah, one of the waitresses, cautiously approached the pass. She was in her late 20s, with kind brown eyes and a gentle demeanor that seemed at odds with the harsh kitchen environment. "Chef," she said softly, trying to diffuse the situation, "the Carmichaels are asking about their order. It's been—" Daniel whirled on her, his eyes flashing. "Do I look like I care what the Carmichaels want right now? Can't you see I'm dealing with incompetence here?" He gestured wildly at Alex, who looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. Sarah flinched but held her ground. "I understand, chef, but they're one of our most valued customers. Perhaps you could do your job and stop interfering with mine," Daniel snapped. "Get out of my kitchen, now!" As Sarah retreated, her cheeks burning with humiliation, Daniel turned back to Alex. "As for you," he growled, "get out of my sight. You're done for tonight, and don't bother coming in tomorrow, or ever again." Alex's face crumpled, but he didn't argue. He simply removed his apron, placed it on the counter, and walked out. his shoulders slumped in defeat. The rest of the staff exchanged quick, worried glances. They all knew it could have been any one of them in Alex's shoes. Daniel surveyed the kitchen, his chest heaving. "Well," he barked, "what are you all staring at? We have orders to fill. Get back to work." The kitchen burst into frenzied activity once more, everyone desperate to avoid becoming Daniel's next target. But as they worked, a palpable undercurrent of resentment and fear permeated the air. This was the reality of working under Chef Daniel, a man whose talent was matched only by his tyranny. As the night wore on, more casualties fell to Daniel's wrath. A sommelier was berated for suggesting the wrong wine pairing. A pastry chef nearly broke down in tears when Daniel declared her chocolate soufflé an insult to cocoa beans everywhere. Even the dishwashers weren't safe, with Daniel storming into their area to criticize the water temperature and the shine on the plates. By the time the last customer left and the kitchen began its nightly cleanup, the staff was exhausted, not just physically but emotionally. They moved like automatons, scrubbing and polishing in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Sarah lingered in the dining room, helping the other waitstaff clear the last of the tables. She couldn't shake the image of Alex's dejected face as he left the kitchen. How many more talented, passionate people would Daniel crush before someone put a stop to it? As she wiped down a table, she overheard a conversation between two of the regular customers who were just leaving. "The food was exquisite as always," one of them said, "but did you notice the atmosphere seemed tense?" The other nodded. "Yes, I sensed it too, and did you see how stressed the staff looked? I wonder if everything's all right in the kitchen." Sarah bit her lip, fighting the urge to speak up. She knew that if word got back to Daniel that she'd been gossiping about the kitchen dynamics, her job would be on the line. But a part of her hoped that maybe, just maybe, if enough people noticed, something would change. As the last of the customers left, Daniel emerged from the kitchen. His chef's whites were pristine, not a hair out of place. Looking at him now, it was hard to reconcile this polished professional with the raging tyrant from earlier. "Excellent service tonight, everyone," he announced, his voice smooth and controlled. "We maintained our standards, as always. Remember, perfection is not an accident. It's a choice we make every single day." The staff nodded dutifully, but Sarah couldn't help noticing the lack of enthusiasm in their eyes. Daniel might think he was inspiring greatness, but all he was really cultivating was fear and resentment. As they filed out of the restaurant, Sarah overheard two of the line cooks whispering. "I can't take much more of this," one of them said. "I'm thinking of quitting." "But where would you go?" the other replied. "Daniel's name on your resume opens doors. We're stuck here if we want to make it in this industry." Sarah sighed as she collected her things. It was a sentiment she'd heard many times before. Daniel's reputation as a culinary genius meant that working at La Perfection was seen as a golden opportunity in the restaurant world. But at what cost? As she stepped out into the cool night air, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had to give. The question was, what would be the catalyst for change, and how much more damage would Daniel do before it happened? Little did she know the winds of change were already stirring, and they would soon blow through La Perfection like a cleansing storm. The following morning, as the first rays of sunlight began to peek through the city's skyscrapers, an unassuming figure made her way towards La Perfection. Grace Williams, a woman in her late 60s with silver hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners, paused for a moment to take in the restaurant's imposing facade. To any passerby, Grace might have looked like just another early morning worker heading to a job. Her clothes were simple but neat, comfortable shoes, dark slacks, and a crisp white shirt. But there was something in her bearing, a quiet dignity and strength that set her apart. As Grace pushed open the heavy door and stepped into the restaurant's spotless interior, she took a deep breath. This was it, the beginning of her undercover mission. Her son Marcus, the CEO of La Perfection, had asked her to take on this role after hearing disturbing rumors about the toxic environment in the kitchen. Grace had agreed without hesitation. After all, this restaurant was more than just a business to her family. It was a legacy, one that she was determined to protect. The maitre d', a young man named Thomas, looked up in surprise as Grace entered. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said politely, "but we're not open yet. Perhaps you'd like to make a reservation for later." Grace smiled warmly. "Actually, I'm here about the dishwasher position. I believe I'm expected." Thomas's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Oh, of course. Let me get Chef Daniel for you." As Thomas disappeared into the back, Grace took a moment to survey her surroundings. The dining room was immaculate, each table set with precision, the silverware gleaming in the soft morning light. It was hard to imagine that behind the scenes in the kitchen there was a storm brewing. A few minutes later, the kitchen doors swung open, and Chef Daniel strode out, his presence immediately filling the room. He looked Grace up and down, his expression a mixture of surprise and barely concealed disdain. "So, you're here for the dishwasher position?" he asked, his tone making it clear that he found the idea laughable. Grace met his gaze steadily. "That's right. I may be older, but I assure you I'm more than capable of handling the work." Daniel's lip curled slightly. "Well, we'll see about that, won't we? Follow me." As they walked through the swinging doors into the kitchen, Grace took in every detail. The gleaming stainless steel surfaces, the state-of-the-art equipment, the palpable tension in the air. It all painted a picture of a high-pressure environment where perfection was the only acceptable standard. Daniel led her to the dishwashing station, gesturing dismissively. "This is where you'll be working. I expect every dish, every pot, every utensil to be spotless. We have a reputation to maintain here, and that starts with the basics. Do you think you can handle that?" Grace nodded, her expression serene. "I'm sure I can, Chef. I've always believed that every job, no matter how small it might seem, is crucial to the overall success of an operation." Daniel looked at her sharply, as if trying to determine whether she was mocking him, but Grace's face remained earnest and open. "Right," Daniel said after a moment. "Well, you can start immediately. Thomas will show you where to change and get you set up with a uniform. Don't expect any special treatment because of your age. In my kitchen, everyone pulls their weight or they're out, understood?" "Perfectly, Chef," Grace replied, her voice steady. "Thank you for the opportunity." As Daniel walked away, already barking orders at some of the early arriving staff, Grace allowed herself a small, knowing smile. She had a feeling that her presence was going to shake things up in ways that Chef Daniel couldn't possibly anticipate. Over the next few hours, as the kitchen came to life around her, Grace settled into her role. She worked efficiently, her movements practiced and sure despite her age. She'd always enjoyed the meditative quality of household tasks, and she approached dishwashing with the same mindful attention she gave to everything in her life. As she worked, Grace observed the dynamics of the kitchen. She watched as Daniel moved from station to station, his critical eye missing nothing. His talent was undeniable, the way he tasted a sauce and immediately knew what it needed, how he could look at a dish and instantly spot any imperfection. But his methods of communication left much to be desired. "Are you trying to poison our customers?" Daniel's voice rang out, causing Grace to look up from her work. He was holding a pan of what looked like perfectly seared fish, glaring at a young cook who was visibly trembling. No, Chef," the cook stammered. "I thought—" "You thought," Daniel interrupted. "I don't pay you to think, I pay you to follow my instructions to the letter. This is overcooked. Start again, and if you can't get it right this time, you might as well pack your knives and leave." Grace watched as the young cook nodded frantically, his hands shaking as he reached for a fresh piece of fish. She felt a pang of sympathy, remembering her own early days in the culinary world. Kitchens had always been high-pressure environments, but this level of fear and intimidation seemed counterproductive. As the day wore on, Grace found herself falling into a rhythm. The constant flow of dishes kept her busy, but she still managed to keep an eye on the kitchen dynamics. She noticed how the staff seemed to flinch whenever Daniel approached, how they spoke in hushed tones when he was out of earshot. It was clear that while they respected his skill, they feared his temper. During a rare lull in the afternoon, As Grace was drying some delicate wine glasses, she felt a presence beside her. Looking up, she saw Sarah, the waitress she'd noticed earlier. Sarah smiled hesitantly, reaching for a stack of plates. "You're doing great," Sarah said softly. "I'm Sarah, by the way. Welcome to La Perfection." Grace returned the smile. "Thank you, Sarah. I'm Grace. It's certainly an interesting place to work." Sarah glanced around nervously before leaning in closer. "Listen, I hope this doesn't sound patronizing, but are you sure you're up for this? Chef Daniel can be pretty harsh, especially on new staff, and the pace here is intense." Grace patted Sarah's hand gently. "I appreciate your concern, dear, but don't you worry about me. I've weathered my fair share of storms in life. This is just another one." Sarah looked at her curiously, sensing there was more to this unassuming dishwasher than met the eye. But before she could say anything more, Daniel's voice boomed across the kitchen. "If you two are done with your little coffee clatch, perhaps you could get back to work. We have a full house tonight, in case you've forgotten." Sarah jumped, quickly grabbing the plates she needed and scurrying back to the dining room. Grace, however, simply nodded at Daniel and returned to her task, her movements as calm and steady as ever. As she worked, Grace couldn't help but think about the contrast between the exquisite food being prepared and the toxic atmosphere in which it was created. She wondered what her son Marcus would say if he could see this firsthand. The restaurant had been his father's dream, and when he'd taken over as CEO, he'd vowed to honor that legacy. But Grace knew that true legacy wasn't just about the food or the accolades. It was about the people, the culture, the values that were passed down. She sighed softly as she placed another stack of gleaming plates on the shelf. It was clear that there was a lot of work to be done here, and not just in the realm of dishwashing. But Grace was nothing if not patient. She knew that sometimes the most profound changes started in the most unexpected places. As the dinner service approached, and the kitchen's energy ramped up to a feverish pitch, Grace steeled herself. She had a feeling that tonight would be a true test, not just of her ability to keep up with the demands of the job, but of her resolve to see this mission through. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them head-on, armed with nothing more than a sponge, a kind heart, and an unwavering determination to make things right. As the days turned into weeks, Grace settled into her role at La Perfection. She arrived each morning before dawn, her quiet presence a constant in the ever-changing whirlwind of the kitchen. But as she became a fixture in the restaurant, she also became an increasingly frequent target for Chef Daniel's ire. It started small at first, a snide comment here, a roll of the eyes there. "Keep up, Grandma," Daniel would snap as he swept past the dishwashing station. "This isn't a retirement home." Grace bore it all with a patient smile, her hands never faltering as they moved from sink to drying rack and back again. But she noticed how the other staff would wince at Daniel's words, how they would shoot her sympathetic glances when they thought she wasn't looking. One particularly busy evening, as the kitchen was in full swing preparing for a high-profile event, Daniel's temper reached a boiling point. Grace was carefully stacking a tray of freshly polished wine glasses when Daniel's voice cut through the chaos like a knife. "What the hell is this?" he bellowed, storming over to the dishwashing station. In his hand, he held a plate with a barely visible smudge near the rim. Grace looked at the plate calmly. "I apologize, Chef. I must have missed that one. I'll rewash it right away." But Daniel wasn't interested in her apology. His face red with anger, he thrust the plate in front of Grace's face. "This is unacceptable. Do you have any idea what's at stake here? We have food critics coming in tonight, and you're sending out dirty plates like we're some greasy spoon diner." The kitchen fell silent, all eyes on the confrontation unfolding before them. Grace stood her ground, her expression serene despite the chef's proximity and volume. "You're right, Chef," she said softly. "It won't happen again." Daniel sneered. "It won't happen again? Is that all you have to say? Maybe you're too old for this job after all. Maybe your eyes are going, along with your ability to do simple tasks." A collective intake of breath could be heard around the kitchen. Daniel had always been harsh, but this level of personal attack was shocking even for him. Grace, however, remained unruffled. "My eyes are just fine, chef," she said, her voice steady. "And I assure you I'm more than capable of doing my job. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have dishes to wash." She turned back to her sink, effectively dismissing Daniel. For a moment he stood there, sputtering with rage. Then, with a final glare, he stormed off, barking orders at the rest of the staff as he went. As soon as Daniel was out of earshot, Sarah approached Grace, her eyes wide with concern. "Are you okay?" she whispered. "I've never seen him go off like that before." Grace gave her a reassuring smile. "I'm fine, dear. It takes more than a few harsh words to shake me." Sarah shook her head in disbelief. "I don't know how you do it. If he spoke to me like that, I'd probably burst into tears." "Well," Grace said, her eyes twinkling, "I've had a lot of practice dealing with difficult people in my life. You'd be surprised what a little patience and perspective can do." As the weeks went on, Daniel's treatment of Grace only worsened. He seemed to take her calm demeanor as a personal affront, going out of his way to criticize her work and make snide comments about her age. One day, as Grace was taking her lunch break in the small staff room, she overheard a conversation between two line cooks. "I can't believe how Chef Daniel treats that poor old lady," one of them whispered. "It's like he's trying to make her quit." "I know," the other replied, "but have you noticed? She never loses her cool. It's like water off a duck's back." Grace smiled to herself as she ate her sandwich. Little did they know that every insult, every cruel jab was being carefully filed away in her memory. She was building a case, piece by piece, and Daniel was unknowingly providing all the evidence she needed. As the humiliation continued, Grace found unexpected allies in the kitchen. Sarah, in particular, seemed to have taken it upon herself to act as a buffer between Grace and Daniel's worst outbursts. She would often find excuses to be near the dishwashing station during particularly stressful moments, her presence a silent support. Other staff members, too, began to show small acts of kindness. A young prep cook would sometimes help Grace carry heavy stacks of plates. The pastry chef would slip her an extra dessert at the end of a long shift. It was as if Grace's quiet dignity in the face of Daniel's abuse had awakened something in the rest of the staff, a sense of solidarity, of shared resistance against the toxic culture that had taken root in the kitchen. But Daniel remained oblivious to this subtle shift. If anything, Grace's continued composure seemed to infuriate him even more. He began to single her out in front of the entire staff, using her as an example of what not to do. "Look at this, everyone," he would say, holding up a pot that Grace had just washed. "This is what happens when you hire someone who should be in a retirement home. See these water spots? This is unacceptable. Do I make myself clear?" The staff would nod silently, their eyes downcast, but Grace could see the growing resentment in their faces. She knew that Daniel's behavior was not just affecting her, but was poisoning the entire work environment. One evening, as Grace was finishing up her shift, Sarah approached her, wringing her hands nervously. "Grace," she said in a low voice, I think you should know. Some of us have been talking. We're thinking of going to the management, maybe even to the owner. This can't go on. The way Chef Daniel treats you, treats all of us. It's not right." Grace placed a comforting hand on Sarah's arm. "I appreciate your concern, dear, but please don't do anything rash. These things have a way of working themselves out." As Sarah walked away, still looking confused, Grace allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The pieces were falling into place. Soon, very soon, it would be time for the next phase of her plan. As the weeks wore on, Chef Daniel's behavior seemed to worsen exponentially. His ego, already inflated to dangerous proportions, swelled even further with each glowing review and prestigious award. La Perfection was at the height of its fame, and Daniel was convinced that he alone was responsible for its success. The kitchen, once a place of culinary creativity and passion, had become a pressure cooker of fear and resentment. Staff turnover was at an all-time high, with new faces appearing almost weekly, only to disappear just as quickly. unable to withstand Daniel's relentless criticism and verbal abuse. One particularly tense evening, as the kitchen prepared for a high-profile charity event, Daniel's behavior reached new lows. He paced the kitchen like a caged tiger, his eyes sharp and critical, looking for any excuse to unleash his temper. "You call that julienne?" he bellowed at a young prep cook, snatching the knife from her hands. "These look like they were cut by a blind monkey. Watch and learn." He proceeded to demonstrate the proper technique, his movements swift and precise. But as he worked, he continued to berate the young cook, his words growing increasingly personal and cruel. "How did you even get hired here?" he sneered. "Did you lie on your resume? Or did you sleep your way into this kitchen?" The cook's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't dare move or speak. The rest of the staff kept their heads down, pretending to be absorbed in their tasks, but Grace could see the tension in their shoulders, the way their hands shook slightly as they worked. As Daniel moved on to his next victim, Grace caught Sarah's eye across the kitchen. The waitress looked pale and drawn, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a look of barely concealed distress. Grace gave her a small reassuring nod, but she could see the toll this environment was taking on everyone. Later that night, as the event was in full swing, Grace overheard a conversation between two of the more experienced line cooks. "I can't take much more of this," one of them whispered, his voice tight with stress. "I've worked in some tough kitchens before, but this is something else." The other cook nodded grimly. "I know what you mean. I've been looking for other jobs, but it's not easy. Everyone knows working under Chef Daniel looks great on a resume, but at what cost?" Grace's heart ached as she listened. She'd seen talented, passionate young chefs reduced to nervous wrecks, their love for cooking slowly crushed under the weight of Daniel's tyranny. It was a tragedy, not just for the individuals involved, but for the culinary world as a whole. As the weeks passed, Daniel's attacks on Grace became more frequent and more personal. It seemed her continued calm in the face of his abuse only served to infuriate him further. One day, as Grace was carefully polishing a set of expensive crystal glasses, Daniel approached her workstation, a sneer on his face. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "if it isn't our resident fossil. Tell me, Grandma, were these the kind of glasses you used back in the Stone Age?" Grace looked up at him, her expression serene. "Actually, Chef," she replied calmly, "in my experience, fine crystal like this has been around for centuries. It's a testament to the enduring nature of quality craftsmanship." Daniel's face darkened at her response. He snatched one of the glasses from her hands, holding it up to the light. "Quality craftsmanship? Let's see about that." With a sudden, violent motion, he smashed the glass against the edge of the sink. Shards of crystal exploded outward, scattering across the floor. The kitchen fell silent, all eyes on Daniel and Grace. "Oops," Daniel said, his voice cold. "Looks like you missed a spot. Better clean that up, hadn't you?" Without waiting for a response, he turned on his heel and strode away, leaving Grace to deal with the mess. As soon as he was out of sight, several staff members rushed over to help, their faces a mixture of shock and sympathy. "Are you all right, Grace?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Did any of the glass cut you?" Grace shook her head, already reaching for a broom. "I'm fine, dear. Nothing wounded but my pride, and perhaps the restaurant's budget for glassware." As they cleaned up the broken crystal, Grace could hear the whispers spreading through the kitchen. Daniel had always been harsh, but this level of deliberate destruction was new. It was as if he was daring someone to challenge him, to give him an excuse to unleash his full fury. As Sarah walked away, still looking uncertain, Grace allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The pieces were falling into place faster than she had anticipated. Soon, very soon, it would be time for the next phase of her plan. The anticipation in the air was palpable, as La Perfection prepared for what was being hailed as the culinary event of the year. A group of international food critics and influential food bloggers were set to dine at the restaurant, their combined opinions holding the power to elevate La Perfection to new heights of fame, or to bring it crashing down. The pressure in the kitchen had reached fever pitch. Chef Daniel, His ego, inflated to dangerous proportions by the high stakes of the evening, was in rare form. His voice echoed through the kitchen, a constant stream of criticism and threats. "If any of you screw this up," he snarled, pacing up and down the line, "you'll be lucky to get a job flipping burgers after I'm done with you. Do I make myself clear?" The staff nodded silently, their faces masks of concentration and barely concealed fear. Grace watched from her station, her heart heavy. She could see the toll this environment was taking on everyone. The trembling hands, the darting eyes, the palpable sense of dread that hung over the kitchen like a storm cloud. As the first orders began to come in, Daniel positioned himself at the pass, scrutinizing each dish with laser-like focus. Nothing escaped his critical eye. A sauce that was a shade too thin, a piece of fish slightly overcooked, a garnish that wasn't perfectly centered. "This is garbage," he bellowed, shoving a plate back at a terrified line cook. "Are you trying to sabotage us? Do it again and do it right this time." Grace kept her head down, focusing on her tasks, but she couldn't help noticing how the tension in the kitchen seemed to be affecting the food. Dishes that usually flowed smoothly from station to station were being rushed, mistakes were being made and hastily covered up. The perfectionism that had once been La Perfection's hallmark was crumbling under the weight of fear and stress. As the evening wore on, it became clear that things were not going as planned. Dishes were being sent back from the dining room, something that almost never happened at La Perfection. The whispers from the servers grew more urgent, their faces pinched with worry as they relayed the critics' less than enthusiastic responses. Daniel's face grew redder with each passing minute, his temper fraying at the edges. He began to micromanage every station, second-guessing even his most experienced chefs. The kitchen, usually a well-oiled machine, began to sputter and stall under his overbearing presence. It all came to a head when the final course, Daniel's signature dish, a complex and delicate dessert, was ready to be sent out. As the pastry chef presented the plates for inspection, Daniel's eyes narrowed. "What is this?" he hissed, jabbing a finger at the intricate sugarwork that crowned each dessert. "This is sloppy, it's uneven, it's amateur hour." The pastry chef, a talented young woman who had trained under some of the best in Paris, tried to defend her work. "Chef, I assure you, each piece was crafted with the utmost care. The slight variations are intentional, to give a more organic feel." But Daniel was beyond reason. In a sudden, violent motion, he swept his arm across the counter, sending the delicate desserts crashing to the floor. The sound of shattering porcelain echoed through the suddenly silent kitchen. "Intentional?" he roared. "The only thing that's intentional here is your incompetence. Get out of my sight, you're fired." The pastry chef stood there, shock and humiliation warring on her face. Then, with a soft sob, she tore off her apron and ran from the kitchen. The rest of the staff watched in horrified silence, frozen in place. It was at this moment that Grace decided she could stand by no longer. Setting down her dishcloth, she stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Chef Daniel," she said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I think perhaps we all need to take a moment to—" But Daniel whirled on her, his face contorted with rage. "You?" he spat. "You dare to speak? You're nothing but a washed-up old woman who can barely keep up with the dishes. What could you possibly know about running a kitchen of this caliber?" The kitchen fell deathly silent. Even Daniel seemed to realize he had crossed a line, but his pride wouldn't let him back down now. He advanced on Grace, looming over her, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "You want to know why you're here, washing dishes at your age? Because you're a failure. You couldn't hack it in a real kitchen, so you ended up here at the bottom of the food chain. And now you have the audacity to question my methods?" Grace stood her ground, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Daniel's fury. "Chef," she said softly, "I understand you're under a lot of pressure, but treating your staff this way isn't going to improve the food or the service. It's only going to—" "Enough," Daniel roared. He grabbed Grace's arm, roughly pulling her towards the dining room. "You think you know so much? Let's see what our esteemed guests think about taking advice from a dishwasher." The staff watched in horror as Daniel dragged Grace through the kitchen doors and into the dining room. The low murmur of conversation died away as heads turned to watch the spectacle unfolding before them. Daniel released Grace's arm, gesturing wildly at her as he addressed the room at large. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption, but I thought you might like to meet the real reason behind any disappointments you may have experienced this evening." He turned to Grace, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Go ahead, enlighten us all. Tell these fine diners, these esteemed critics, how we should be running this restaurant. I'm sure they're dying to hear the wisdom of a dishwasher." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The diners looked uncomfortable, some averting their eyes, others watching the scene unfold with a mix of fascination and disgust. At one table, a group of well-dressed individuals, clearly the food critics, exchanged meaningful glances. Grace took a deep breath, looking around the room. This was not how she had planned for things to unfold, but perhaps it was for the best. Sometimes, the truth needed to come out in the harshest light for real change to occur. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and steady, "I apologize for this disruption to your evening. What you're witnessing is the unfortunate culmination of a toxic work environment that has been festering for far too long." Daniel's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "How dare you?" he began, but Grace held up a hand, silencing him with a look. "I may be just a dishwasher in your eyes, Chef Daniel," she continued, "but I've seen more kitchens and more chefs than you've had hot dinners, and I can tell you this. A kitchen run on fear and ego will never produce truly great food. It may win awards, it may impress critics, but it will never have that spark of joy, that love that turns good food into something transcendent." She turned to address the diners directly. "You came here tonight expecting perfection, but true perfection in cooking doesn't come from bullying and intimidation. It comes from passion, from creativity, from a team working together in harmony. What you've tasted tonight is the result of a kitchen in chaos, of talented chefs too afraid of reprisal to trust their own instincts." The room was silent for a moment as her words sank in. Then, to everyone's surprise, a slow clap started from the critics' table. Soon, other diners joined in, the applause spreading through the room. Daniel stood there, his face a mask of confusion and anger. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, a new voice cut through the noise. "I think we've heard enough." All heads turned to see a man standing in the doorway. He was in his early 40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his presence commanding attention. It was Marcus Williams, the CEO and owner of La Perfection. Marcus strode into the room, his eyes taking in the scene before him. He nodded to Grace, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth, before turning to address the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I must apologize for this unseemly display. This is not what La Perfection stands for, nor is it the kind of behavior we condone in any of our staff, regardless of their position." He turned to Daniel, his voice cold. "Chef, I think it's time we had a talk in private. If you'd join me in my office." As Marcus led a shell-shocked Daniel away, the room erupted in murmurs. Grace found herself surrounded by staff and diners alike, all eager to hear more of her story. Sarah pushed through the crowd, her eyes wide with realization. "Grace," she whispered, "who are you really?" Grace smiled, patting Sarah's hand. "Just someone who cares deeply about this restaurant and the people who work here. Now, why don't we all get back to work? I have a feeling there are going to be some big changes around here, and we should be prepared." As the staff filed back into the kitchen, there was a new energy in the air. The fear and tension that had been their constant companions for so long were replaced by a cautious optimism. Whatever happened next, they all knew one thing for certain: La Perfection would never be the same again. In the aftermath of the dining room confrontation, La Perfection was abuzz with speculation and nervous energy. The kitchen staff huddled in small groups, whispering amongst themselves, while the dining room staff struggled to maintain an air of normalcy for the remaining guests. Meanwhile, in the opulent office tucked away on the restaurant's top floor, Marcus Williams sat behind his imposing desk. His fingers steepled as he regarded Chef Daniel with a mixture of disappointment and controlled anger. Daniel, for his part, seemed to have shrunk in on himself. Gone was the bombastic tyrant of the kitchen. In his place sat a man who looked lost, his chef's whites seeming to hang off him like an ill-fitting costume. "Do you have any idea," Marcus began, his voice low and controlled, "how close we came to destroying everything tonight? Years of hard work, my father's legacy, all of it nearly undone because of your ego." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mr. Williams, I can explain. That woman, she doesn't understand the pressures of running a kitchen of this caliber. Marcus held up a hand, silencing him. "That woman, as you so dismissively call her, has forgotten more about running a successful restaurant than you'll ever know. But we'll get to that later. Right now, I want to hear your version of events. And Daniel, I suggest you choose your words very carefully." For a moment, Daniel hesitated. He could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet, sensed that his position, once so secure, was now precarious. But old habits die hard, and soon he found himself falling back on the tactics that had served him so well in the past. Deflection, excuses, and outright lies. "Mr. Williams," he began, leaning forward earnestly, "you have to understand the pressure we're under every night. Perfection isn't just our name, it's our standard. And sometimes maintaining that standard requires firm leadership." Marcus's expression remained impassive, giving nothing away. Encouraged by the lack of immediate rebuke, Daniel continued, "Tonight was particularly stressful. We had those critics in and everyone was on edge. I admit I may have been a bit harsh with some of the staff, but it was only because I care so deeply about upholding the reputation of La Perfection." He paused, gauging Marcus's reaction. Seeing no change in his employer's expression, he pressed on, his confidence growing with each word. "As for that dishwasher, well, I'm sorry to say it, but she's been a problem since day one. Slow, careless, always sticking her nose where it doesn't belong. Tonight, she nearly ruined everything. She was late bringing up clean plates, which threw off our entire timing, and then she had the audacity to question my methods in front of the entire kitchen." Daniel's voice rose as he spoke, his face flushing with remembered anger. "Can you imagine? A dishwasher presuming to tell me, how to run my kitchen. I had no choice but to make an example of her. For the good of the restaurant, you understand." He sat back, a self-satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. In his mind, he had crafted a perfect narrative, one that painted him as the beleaguered hero, valiantly upholding standards in the face of incompetence and insubordination. Marcus remained silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving Daniel's face. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but there was a steel behind it that made Daniel's smile falter. "That's quite a story, Daniel. Quite a story indeed. Now let me tell you what really happened tonight." Marcus stood walking around the desk to stand directly in front of Daniel. "That dishwasher you so casually dismissed? Her name is Grace Williams. She's my mother, and she knows more about running a successful restaurant than you ever will." Daniel's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Marcus continued, his voice growing harder with each word. "My mother has been working undercover in this kitchen for weeks, at my request. I'd been hearing rumors about the toxic environment you'd created, about the fear and resentment brewing among the staff. But I didn't want to believe it. I thought surely the man I'd trusted with my father's legacy couldn't have fallen so far." He shook his head, disappointment etched in every line of his face. "I was wrong. Tonight, I saw with my own eyes the kind of leadership you think is necessary to maintain our standards. I watched you bully and belittle your staff. I saw you destroy thousands of dollars worth of food and equipment in your tantrums. And worst of all, I witnessed you drag an elderly woman, my mother, into the dining room to humiliate her in front of our guests." Daniel slumped in his chair, the full weight of his actions finally hitting him. "Mr. Williams, I didn't know. If I had known who she was—" "If you had known who she was, you would have treated her with respect," Marcus finished for him, his voice sharp. "That's exactly the problem, Daniel. You shouldn't need to know someone's status or connection to treat them with basic human dignity." He walked back around the desk, settling into his chair with a heavy sigh. You know, when my father opened this restaurant, he had a vision. He wanted to create not just great food, but a place where people could come together, where creativity could flourish, somewhere that would nurture the next generation of culinary talent. Marcus fixed Daniel with a piercing stare. Instead, you've turned it into a glorified sweatshop. You've driven away talented chefs, crushed the spirits of young cooks, all to feed your own ego. And for what? A few glowing reviews, some shiny awards? Is that really worth the human cost? Daniel sat in stunned silence, the full weight of his actions finally sinking in. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of genuine shame. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. I think it's time we discussed your future at La Perfection, Daniel, or rather, the lack thereof. As the gravity of the situation settled over him, Daniel realized that his world, the empire he thought he'd built, was crumbling around him. And as he sat there, facing the consequences of his actions, he couldn't help but wonder, was there any way to salvage not just his career, but the person he'd become? As the confrontation between Marcus and Daniel unfolded in the office upstairs, the kitchen of La Perfection was a hive of nervous energy. Staff members huddled in small groups, whispering amongst themselves, casting furtive glances at the office door. The events of the evening had shaken everyone to their core, and speculation ran rampant about what would happen next. In the midst of this chaos, Grace stood calmly at her station, methodically working through the mountain of dishes left over from the ill-fated dinner service. Despite the revelation of her true identity, she had insisted on finishing her shift. The work doesn't stop just because the cat's out of the bag, she had said with a wry smile. Sarah, still reeling from the night's revelations, approached Grace hesitantly. The young waitress had always sensed there was more to the unassuming dishwasher than met the eye, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. Grace, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, I don't even know what to say. All this time you were... Grace looked up from her work, her eyes twinkling with a mixture of mischief and kindness. The owner's mother, the big boss's mum, the secret inspector. She chuckled softly. I've been called many things in my life, Sarah, but at the end of the day I'm just Grace, a woman who's seen a lot, learned a lot, and cares deeply about this restaurant and the people who work here. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. But why? Why go through all this? You could have just... Waltzed in here, throwing my weight around? Grace finished for her. She sighed, setting down the plate she'd been washing. That's not my style, dear, and more importantly, it wouldn't have shown us the truth. Sometimes to really understand a problem, you have to experience it from the ground up. She gestured around the kitchen, her expression growing serious. This restaurant, it's more than just a business to our family. It was my late husband's dream, his legacy. When Marcus took over, he vowed to honor that legacy, but somewhere along the way things went off track. We started hearing whispers about the pressure, the fear, the toxic environment that had taken root here. Grace's eyes grew distant, lost in memory. I remember when this kitchen was a place of joy, of creativity. Yes, the standards were high, the work was hard, but there was a camaraderie, a shared passion that made it all worthwhile. Watching what it had become under Chef Daniel's reign, it broke my heart. Sarah nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. So you came to see for yourself, to experience what we were going through? Exactly, Grace confirmed. Marcus and I agreed that the only way to truly understand the situation was to live it. So I became Grace the dishwasher, the lowest rung on the kitchen ladder. And let me tell you, it was an eye-opening experience. She turned to face Sarah fully, her expression softening. But it wasn't all bad, you know. Yes, I saw the fear, the stress, the cruel behavior, but I also saw moments of incredible kindness and resilience. I saw how you all looked out for each other, how you managed to create beauty and deliciousness even under the harshest conditions. That's what gave me hope. That's what convinced me that this place is worth saving. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. All the stress, all the fear she'd been holding back for so long suddenly came rushing to the surface. "What's going to happen now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "To us? To the restaurant?" Grace reached out, squeezing Sarah's hand gently. "Now, my dear, we rebuild. We take what we've learned, the good and the bad, and we use it to create something better. La Perfection isn't just a name, it's a goal we strive for every day, in how we cook, how we serve, and most importantly, how we treat each other." She glanced up at the office door, a determined glint in her eye. "Marcus is up there right now, having a long overdue conversation with Chef Daniel. I don't know exactly what will happen, but I do know this. Things are going to change around here, and we're going to need all hands on deck to make it work." Just then, the office door opened. The entire kitchen fell silent as Marcus emerged, his face grave but resolute. Behind him, looking shell-shocked and deflated, came Chef Daniel. Marcus cleared his throat, addressing the assembled staff. "Everyone, may I have your attention, please? We've had a challenging evening, to say the least, but out of this chaos, we have an opportunity to redefine what La Perfection means, not just for our customers, but for all of us who work here." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the kitchen. "There are going to be some big changes in the coming days and weeks. I know change can be scary, but I want you all to know that you are valued, your input is welcome, and together we're going to create something truly special here." As Marcus continued to outline his vision for the future of La Perfection, Grace watched the faces of the staff around her. She saw hope dawning in their eyes, tentative smiles beginning to form. But she also saw uncertainty, particularly when their gazes fell on Chef Daniel, who stood silently by Marcus's side, looking more lost and defeated than anyone had ever seen him. Marcus, noticing the tension, addressed the elephant in the room. "I know many of you are wondering about Chef Daniel's future with us. The truth is, we've had a long and difficult conversation about the events that have transpired, not just tonight, but over the past months and years." He turned to Daniel, his expression a mix of disappointment and cautious hope. "Chef, would you like to say something to the team?" Daniel stepped forward, and for a moment he seemed to struggle to find his voice. Gone was the bombastic, larger-than-life persona that had dominated the kitchen for so long. In its place stood a man who looked human, flawed, vulnerable. He began, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I owe you all an apology. No, more than that. I owe you a profound and heartfelt apology for my behavior, my treatment of you, and the toxic environment I created." He looked around the kitchen, making eye contact with each member of the staff. Some met his gaze steadily, while others looked away, the wounds still too fresh. "I convinced myself that my methods were necessary for achieving greatness, that the pressure I put on you, the fear I instilled, was the only way to maintain our standards. I was wrong, so terribly, destructively wrong." Daniel's eyes landed on Grace, and a flicker of shame crossed his face. "It took someone with true wisdom and strength to show me the error of my ways, someone who had nothing to prove, but chose to put herself in the line of fire to protect others." He turned back to the staff, his voice growing stronger. "I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not sure I deserve it, but I want you all to know that I see now the damage I've done, to this restaurant, to all of you, and to myself, and I am committed to doing whatever it takes to make things right." A heavy silence fell over the kitchen as Daniel's words sank in. It was Sarah who finally broke it, her voice quiet but firm. "Chef," she said, "I won't pretend that the past can be erased. You've hurt a lot of people, pushed away a lot of talent, but I think I speak for many of us when I say that if you're genuinely committed to change, we're willing to give you that chance." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the staff. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. Marcus nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well said, Sarah. And that brings me to our next steps. Chef Daniel will be taking a leave of absence. During this time, he'll be working closely with industry mentors and undergoing intensive leadership training. If, and only if, he can demonstrate real, lasting change, he'll be welcomed back into the La Perfection family. not as the sole authority, but as part of a collaborative leadership team. He turned to address the entire staff. In the meantime, we'll be bringing in some fresh perspectives, guest chefs, culinary innovators, and most importantly, we'll be looking to all of you for input on how we can make La Perfection not just a great restaurant, but a great place to work. As Marcus continued to outline his plans for the future, Grace felt a sense of pride and hope swelling in her chest. This was why she had embarked on this undercover mission, not to tear down, but to rebuild, to remind everyone, from the lowliest dishwasher to the head chef, that true perfection comes not from fear and domination, but from passion, creativity, and mutual respect. As the meeting wound down and the staff began to disperse, each lost in thought about the changes to come, Grace found herself approached by Daniel. The once imposing chef seemed almost sheepish as he stood before her. "Mrs. Williams," he began, then corrected himself. "Grace, I don't even know where to begin. The way I treated you, the things I said." Grace held up a hand, stopping him. "Daniel, let me tell you something my late husband used to say. In the kitchen, as in life, we all make mistakes. The true test of a chef isn't in never burning the sauce, it's in how you recover from it. You've burned a lot more than sauce, but the question now is, how will you recover?" Daniel nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said softly. "I've lost sight of why I became a chef in the first place, the joy of creating, of nurturing talent, of bringing happiness to people through food. I want to find that again." Grace smiled, a twinkle in her eye. "Well, young man, it sounds like you're on the right path. Just remember, a little bit of humility makes for a much better seasoning than an excess of ego." As Daniel walked away, visibly mulling over her words, Grace felt a presence at her side. It was Marcus, looking at her with a mixture of admiration and amusement. "You know, Mum," he said, shaking his head, "when we came up with this plan, I never imagined it would unfold quite like this. You never cease to amaze me." Grace chuckled, patting her son's cheek affectionately. "Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? Now, don't think this means I'm retiring to a rocking chair. I expect to be consulted on all major decisions going forward. After all, I've got quite the unique perspective on this place now." Marcus laughed, the sound echoing through the kitchen. For the first time in too long, genuine joy and laughter filled the air of La Perfection. It was the first step on a new journey, one that promised to be challenging, but ultimately rewarding. As the night wound down and the last of the staff filed out, Grace took a final look around the kitchen. She could almost see the ghosts of the past, the fear, the anger, the crushed spirits, fading away, replaced by a tentative hope for the future. There was still much work to be done, many wounds to heal, but the ingredients for success were all there. With a satisfied nod, Grace hung up her apron for the last time. Her undercover mission was complete, but her work was far from over. La Perfection was about to enter a new era, and she had a feeling it was going to be the restaurant's finest hour yet. Have you ever witnessed or experienced toxic behavior in a high-pressure work environment like La Perfection's kitchen? And do you think the culinary industry is particularly prone to overlooking or excusing such conduct? Share your experiences or thoughts in the comments below. I would love to read your comments. And if you enjoyed this tale of culinary drama and redemption, I invite you to subscribe to my channel. I pour my heart into crafting these inspiring stories for you, and your support is what keeps me going. I appreciate having you on this journey.